I'm Christina.
I'm Veronica.
And welcome to Christina and Veronica's AP Euro channel.
Today we will be discussing a cool radicalism and feminism documentary.
The French and Industrial Revolutions and the struggle of European countries to adapt to a modern world triggered significant political and social movements and new theories to deal with them. Radicalism is one attempt of the people of Europe to come to terms with the changing world. For starters, radicalism, also known as Chartism, aimed to transform Britain into a democracy. In the early 19th century, political radicals drew up the People's Charter, which demanded universal male suffrage. The radical reformers also denounced their opponents as seeking to keep people in slavery and political degradation. Women also took part by founding political unions, setting up Chartist summer schools, organizing boycotts, and joining Chartist temperance associations. In addition, radical reformers organized a campaign in the early 19th century with large public meetings, fiery speeches, and torchlight parades. They presented petitions for the People's Charter to the House of Commons. The House of Commons refused to act, so the Chartists allied themselves with the working class strike movements in manufacturing districts. The Chartist movement took inspiration from many European revolutions and mounted several gigantic demonstrations to force Parliament to grant all adults male suffrage and the right to vote, but the Parliament refused and no uprising occurred. A buzzword is Chartist because their protests helped to characterize radicalism as a movement because their ideas of adult male suffrage and increased freedoms were considered radical during the early 19th century. In addition, Luddites were also a very important part of the radical movement. Mainly unskilled workers, Luddites used violence to resist technology because it took away their jobs. They also thought that by damaging or refusing technology, they could gain back their jobs. An example of the violent actions of Luddites was that in the early 19th century, bands of handloom weavers wrecked factories and broke machines and burned mills in England. A buzzword seen here is technology because the implementation of technology into the daily lives of people, especially in the workplace, triggered the violent actions of the Luddites, which is an important concept regarding radicalism. Luddite and Chartist ideas were considered radical in the context of their time because they fought for more rights and generally against many impacts of the technology in an industrial society. The ideas of the radicals failed in the early 19th century because the technology they were opposing and protesting against was thriving, so their opposing beliefs were not as important to all of the people technology was benefiting, like businesses and the government. In addition, many Chartist and radical beliefs, such as the increase in freedoms and suffrage of all adult men in society, were not supported by enough people in society, ultimately causing their ideas to fail in the early 19th century. However, over time, these radical ideas were considered by more and more people as members of society, allowing them to become a commonplace in Western society today.
Now, speaking of radicalism, you can easily transition to our next topic, which is the first wave of feminism in Europe. During the first half of the 19th century, the demand for women's equality had already appeared, and patriarchy was being challenged, which got the ball rolling on the feminist theory. Which brings us to the question, why did feminism develop at this particular time? Early feminism was influenced by the Enlightenment in Europe during the late 1700s. The focus of the Enlightenment was on reason and equality for all. This movement was so inspiring and eventually lit the fuse on both an American and French Revolution. French Revolution was the first time women's citizenship emerged in discussions, whether this was due to hardships in France and women being the only ones to largely stand on line and wait for bread that might never come, or because women were pivotal in organizing the salons that became the thinking tanks of the Enlightenment. Feminism did emerge as a movement. The first person to coin the phrase feminism is attributed to Charles Fourier. Charles Fourier was born in Besançon, France. He was born into a successful business family and was a socialist and feminist thinker. He made bold statements like, "There is no cause which produces social progress or decline as rapidly as a change in the condition of women." His more famous book, The Theory of the Four Movements, was published in 1808, soon after the French Revolution, and explains the roots of utopian socialism, including the feminist ideas that go along with it. Mostly, although Fourier did not imagine a completely classless and equal society, he did think that everyone should somehow share in a generous and shared standard of living. The emancipation of women was essential to Fourier's vision of that harmonious community. During the late 18th century, there were additional women's rights activists, including Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges. Both de Gouges and Wollstonecraft developed thoughtful concepts on equality regarding marriages, sexes, education, and natural rights. We start with Olympe de Gouges, who many regard as the first French feminist. Olympe de Gouges was born into a bourgeois family in 1748. She was a social reformer and playwright from France who advocated for all those she saw and oppressed, including orphan children and women, especially unwed women. The word advocate is an important buzzword because all the significant feminists like de Gouges and Wollstonecraft advocated for their rights as women. De Gouges was well educated, intelligent, and beautiful. She thought of marriage as slavery for women. She called it for some sort of welfare state, trial by jury, and divorce laws that would help women and children from abject poverty. De Gouges welcomed the French Revolution, but was frustrated that equality did not apply to women. In 1791, de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen in response to 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, because she wanted to assert women's rights as well as the rights of man. De Gouges also spoke out and protested for equality and opposed slavery, violence, and oppression. Olympe de Gouges had lived an outspoken life, and after she opposed the execution of Louis XVI, went on to promote the monarchy, which was illegal, and Robespierre had her arrested. Ultimately, she was sent to the guillotine. Another feminist writer was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was a radicalistic feminist and a renowned women's rights activist, born in London. Her father was violent and physically abused her mother and squandered money. She stayed with her mother but went through extreme poverty. After jobs as a lady's companion, and opened and closed a school, and a job as a governess, she was dissatisfied with the limited options open to women. She began to write the Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. She felt reason should govern natural instincts and passions. She argued that girls should be educated to acquire the necessary resources to live independently. Independence is an important buzzword here because it's what the radical women and feminists of the 19th century have been fighting for. In 1790, she published A Vindication to the Rights of Men, in response to Edmund Burke's criticisms of French revolutionaries. In 1792, she wrote a second essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Wollstonecraft was critical of the Jacobsons and their lack of feminist politics. They refused to educate girls alongside boys, and they hadn't granted women full citizenship and equal rights. Wollstonecraft promoted the idea that women share equally in the gift of reason with men. She thought that women were educated into independence. Until women were more rationally educated, the progress of human virtue and improvement of knowledge would be slower. Women should be considered as human beings which first had the same capacities and abilities to develop as men. Women had to try and benefit from what little advantages they had. In marriage, married women couldn't own property or sign legal documents. Working wives were also required to hand over salaries to their husbands. The next feminist is Flora Tristan. In the summer of 1848, a French feminist named Flora Tristan began writing books which became popular for promoting the universal unity without distinctions between men and women. She had a French mother and a Peruvian father. After the sudden death of her father, an exiled Peruvian colonel, she remained with her mother in abject poverty and was forced to work hard. Flora Tristan lived a life that was a lifelong pursuit of independence, as much from her husband and poverty from womanhood and the social attitude of a woman's plate. One of her famous quotes is, "The emancipation of a woman will become the emancipation of a worker." To conclude, the writings and experience of these French women during the Revolution propelled women, reason, emancipation, natural rights, and feminism in the collective European consciousness. The historical claim that rights were extended to was correct. In the 19th century, it was absolutely radical to demand a woman's independence, emancipation, and access to education, and equal capability for reason. These demands went completely against long-standing ideologies that women were to be submissive and belonged in the home and the property of their husbands. In the end, this radical effort to include women failed at this time. The white male leadership of the revolution shaped the priorities of the movement, and it excluded the concerns and participation of women and people of color.
Thank you guys so much for watching our amazing, cool, interesting documentary about radicalism and feminism. We really hope that you learned a lot.
Yep, and if you did enjoy this video, please make sure to subscribe or leave a like so that way you can see more videos like this.
I'm Christina.
I'm Veronica.
And we're signing off.